Welcome to the AA Podcast, our little corner of the web where we are not afraid to discuss tough questions like,
when did nutrition, health, movement, and stress management become alternative medicine?
Where we embrace challenges in all aspects of life to become healthier and stronger versions of ourselves.
And where food and movement are the best kinds of medicine, and cooking meals at home is a revolutionary act.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the AA Podcast. This is Ashley Olson.
And I'm Andrea Crane.
We are going to be doing a little sidestep of an episode where actually I think it's going to be a really great episode. So before we get into that, I always like to do a little teaser, and I do a horrible job at it, but it's fine.
Now everybody's wondering, what the heck are they talking about today?
What is she wanting
Wouldn't
to
you
talk
like
about
to
today?
know?
Yes. But before we do that, we always share our weekly Bible verse, and mine is coming from 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. And it says, all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works.
Okay. And mine is Colossians 3:23 and 24. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ.
Amen. Well,
Okay.
Andrea, so
This is like the ultimate nerd episode.
yes.
And yeah.
Yeah. No, I think this is going to be really good because honestly, I know I'm going to learn a lot on this because, um, so what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about how to read actual studies and literature because a lot of times, especially with the Instagrams and these just, one-liner headlines, it'll be say, eat XYZ and it doubles your chance of getting cancer.
Mhm.
And it's like, oh my gosh, we
Mhm.
need to stop this. And, or we're
Yeah.
sharing it to all of our friends and family and we're
Yeah.
doing all this. But if you actually get down to the nitty gritty,
Mhm.
it's really not that.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to talk about how to be discerning in the stuff that you read. And so
Mhm.
I want you guys to know, like, I literally took 3 semesters on a class that really focused on evaluating clinical literature in my doctoral program. So like there's a lot to go through. There's a lot to learn here. So this is a high level sort of break it down, high level, um, just some considerations that you can apply immediately after listening to this episode to anything that you're reading, to anything that you are bombarded with in the headlines, anything that your friends send you on the socials, so that you can evaluate things properly. Because there is some really good data out there, but how do we weed through it? Because there's so much trash and there's so much misinterpretation as well. So anyway, we're gonna kind of get to the bottom of some of this today.
And I think we kind of touched on this in one of our episodes. I want to say it's
Mm-hmm.
the sunscreen episode where they had taken
Uh,
the sunscreen. Like there was like, I'd have to go back, but it kind of just proved like the headlines didn't match what the actual
mm-hmm.
study results were, but they were able to clickbait you
Right, exactly.
and get your attention. So
Mm-hmm.
basically, what is a study, Andrea? Like what? Let's just understand some of the basics.
Yeah, okay, that's great. So we're going to start with just this concept of a study. Like I feel like we think we know what this is, but there are very specific definitions that put studies into different groups. So essentially, like we're either going to observe or we're going to intervene. Okay, so some studies are considered observational, and this is where we either sit and look backwards at a bunch of data about a group, right, that we've collected over the course of years, or we sit and we look forward about data. So like for instance, if I was going to take a group of 10 women and do a retrospective analysis, I would have followed these women over the last like year or 5 years even, and asked them very specific questions, like maybe once a month. I asked them to weigh themselves or to monitor their blood sugar. And then I asked them other questions about, okay, what does your diet look like? What does your stress level look like? What do your relationship stress look like? And so then you can look back as you're sifting through all this data, and you can make certain conclusions like, okay, the women who were more stressed put on X number of pounds per year that we observed them. And so then you can draw certain correlations, not causations, but you could draw certain correlations. All right. So that's like a retrospective study. Then you could do a prospective study where you take those 10 women and you say, hey, we're going to ask you these questions going forward. All right. So then there are interventions. Now, again, in the observational studies, I didn't ask these people to do anything. I'm just asking them
Mm-mm.
questions about their lives.
Mhm.
Interventional studies, these are more like clinical trials where you're testing an intervention. So I want to know if let's see, if I feed you a tablespoon of olive oil every single day for the next 2 years, what I'm looking for, what benefits could we derive from that? All right. So that would be like an intervention or like a drug study. All right. This is, or like taking vitamin D. Okay. So we've got this hypothesis, then we've got this intervention, then we're going to test the intervention. Okay. Now, there are also within the observational studies, like let's say that retrospective look. Now, probably the most famous one in recent years is the Women's Health Initiative. That and I have, boy, have I raved about this one, ranted more like it, because this is where the data was so grossly misinterpreted, and it took all of those women off of their hormones, and so nobody got bioidentical hormone replacement therapy for the last, 20 years because of this data. So Women's Health Initiative, that was a retrospective study where they said, oh my gosh, hormone replacement therapy causes cancer, which it absolutely does not. It in actuality, it is preventive of cancer. And so, yeah, that was a huge problem. So anyway, you can then look at, like, if you've got 10,000 women, and they do this a lot with nurses, right? Because they're in healthcare, they know how to fill these things out. They're fairly reliable folks. And so they'll study a lot of women's issues with large groups of nurses. And I believe that's what the Women's Health Initiative was, is they took a group of nurses and looked at them over the course of a lot of years. And so you can go back and say, hey, okay, I want to look at blood pressure on this group. Okay, so you can go back because they track that. I want to look at cholesterol in this group. Okay, you can go back and look at that. So those are called like nested groups. Those are groups within groups. So when you've got this giant amount of data, you can go through and say, hey, I want to look at this, or I want to look at this, or I want to look at this, and you can get a nested group. So there's all kinds of ways to do this, but that's essentially the high level on what a study is. Then there's this concept of hierarchy of evidence. So does the evidence warrant looking at, like, how legit is this evidence? And so the very bottom rung of the evidence tree is a case report. This is basically like Ashley reporting on what happened with her. Okay? So like if I instituted magnesium in Ashley's diet, and then she had all these amazing benefits and I write it up, that's a case report. That's one person. That's one set of circumstances. That's her unique genetics. That's her unique circumstance, her unique exposures, everything just her. That is the lowest level. Nobody should be making changes to themselves based off of a case report. Okay.
Exactly.
Then observational studies. We talked about that. Observational studies are next. So they are only they are only slightly above a case report in terms of legitimacy of evidence. All right. Then you get into the randomized control trials, and this is where you get into the interventional studies generally. So you're testing an intervention, um, and then the highest level of evidence, the most legit of all the evidence, is called a meta-analysis. And this is where researchers go out and they say, okay, we want to look at the benefit of, let's say, vitamin D3 on um oh gosh, cancer prevention. Okay, you could look at that, and you could look at that over the course of time, but those researchers, if they want to put out a meta-analysis, they're going to go out and get all of the randomized control trials that they can find that fit this specific group of parameters, and they're going to say, okay, we're going to look at these 100 studies. We're going to pare that down to like maybe 12 or 15 that fit what we're looking at. And it's essentially a study of studies. Okay. So that is where they say, okay, so in this body of literature, we found that there were these commonalities. That is the strongest level of evidence that there is. So
Okay.
that's called a meta-analysis. Um, Now, there's also key terminology that you have to understand. So population, that's easy to understand. That's just who was being studied here, right?
And that's
Then,
important too, right? Because
oh
like
yeah,
if it's like 10 people,
we're getting to that. Yeah, no,
yeah,
we're definitely getting to that. So population just means who was studied, what was the population. Intervention. What do they do? What was the intervention? What were they looking at? Now, this is critical, especially in an interventional study. Who was the control? So a control literally means compared to what? So you give the intervention, but then you have to compare it to somebody that didn't have the intervention, right?
right.
That's called your control group. Now, in some of these studies, you got to be careful with control group because they are, man, they're tricky with these things. Sometimes, if they want to, if a study group has a desired outcome that they're looking for, they will manipulate the control to show what they want. Like, for
Mhm.
instance, let's say that you're trying to prove that fish oil doesn't really do much
Mhm.
for, let's say, cholesterol. Okay.
Mhm.
So I have seen studies where they'll do something like, okay, our control group is going to be, we got to give them a pill so that they don't know, right? Because it's blinded. So we're going to give them a pill of olive oil as our control. Well, olive oil has a positive impact on cholesterol. So at the end of the day, if you're trying to prove that fish oil doesn't really do much and so supplements are worthless, then you've got your fish oil group having this much improvement, which, like, let's say a 5 improvement, and then you've got your olive oil group showing a 4 improvement. Well, against placebo, 5 and 4, that's not really clinically significant. So you can say, it only had just this little teeny tiny impact over placebo. But what was your placebo? What was your control? What was your control group? So that matters.
Mhm.
The outcome. What were they measuring? What was their primary outcome? And we're going to look at primary outcome later on because this is really important too. So, at the very beginning of the study, what did they say? What are we looking for? Because you got to design the study around what you're looking for, not around what you find. You're designing it around what you're looking for. Okay. And that's going to become important here in a minute. Um, so some pitfalls in terms of applying studies to ourselves. So we've learned about level of evidence, we've learned about these terms. And so a possible pitfall is, what if the population is rats? Does that apply to humans? Well, not
No.
necessarily.
Mhm.
It doesn't necessarily. And so, for instance, when you see all these headlines talking about um energy drinks impair muscle tissue growth. And so now everybody's freaking out about energy drinks and, oh my gosh, we got to get these out. These are terrible. Um, well, one of the studies was a rat study where they took sarcomeres, this is rat muscle tissue, in a petri dish and just like dumped energy drink on top of it and saw that it, I don't know, impaired hypertrophy. Anyway, I have to go back and read this study again, but it was absolutely ridiculous. And so what they drew from that for a headline was crazy. Absolutely crazy. So please take these really sensational things with a grain of salt because
Mm,
most of them are just ridiculous.
mm. So frustrating.
Yeah, it is really frustrating. So the next thing that we're going to get into now, this is critical, and you guys, this is getting a little bit into the mathematical weeds. Studies are all about mathematics, but if you stay with me and if you maybe listen to this a couple of times, this section here, this is numbers that you should understand. If you can wrap your mind around this and grasp this, this alone is if I could have you pull one thing out of this episode, it would be an understanding of this. Okay? So, the first thing I want to talk about, there are three things I want you to understand. I want you to understand relative risk, absolute risk, and number needed to treat. Okay. These are all critical values. And if you can get this, pardon me, I got something in there. If you can get this, then you are so far ahead of anyone that's looking at this. Okay. So let's start with relative risk. Relative risk reduction. Now, this is something that where if you see a headline that, this cuts cancer risk in half. Okay, wow, that is huge, right? That's
Right.
big. That's big time. Um but let's say that you've got 100 people, okay? Actually, let's say let's make it more realistic. Let's say you've got 1,000 people. Out of those 1,000 people, if those 1,000 people, let's say one of them will get, my gosh, let's just make it something dumb. Let's just say like liver cancer from drinking energy drinks. Okay, these people drink tons and tons of energy drinks. Out of 1,000 people drinking tons of energy drinks, one person will develop liver cancer. All right. No, let's make it two. I'm
Yeah, that's what I was
sorry, you
gonna
guys.
say.
I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants here. But okay, so two people out of the 1,000 will develop liver cancer, and they're all drinking tons of energy drinks. All right. So your intervention is we're going to cut out all the energy drinks, and in the control group, they're going to still drink them. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So in the intervention group that are not drinking energy drinks, now all of a sudden in the 1,000 that you're looking at, only one of them develops cancer. Okay. So you have cut your cancer risk in half.
Yep.
That is a relative risk because it went from from 2 in 1,000 to 1 in 1,000. Yeah,
Yep.
2 to 1. That's a 50%
50%.
risk. Yep. But that's called a relative risk.
So why do
Now,
they do that? Because
because it makes it sound bigger. Because
okay.
it's something that they want you to do. It's the whoever's interpreting the study, they're looking either for a headline or they're trying to move the population in a certain direction. Like if they specifically told you that an intervention decreased your risk of contracting something
Right.
when your risk was 2 in 1,000, and now they bumped it down to 1 in 1,000,
Mm-hmm.
then they're saying, boy, you better get this intervention, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yep.
it cuts your risk in half.
Mm-hmm.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay. So your absolute risk, that's where the hard data is. So your chance of getting something is 2 in 1,000 if you continue along your current path. If you completely get that intervention out, then maybe it cuts your risk to 1 in 1,000. So that's going from 0.001 down to point zero zero or point zero zero two down to point zero zero 0.001.
Hmm.
No thanks.
Minuscule.
Minuscule. That's called the absolute risk reduction. All right.
So when you see a study, do
Mhm.
they like when you go onto like Google Scholar and you pull up a
Mhm.
study,
Mhm.
do they tell you immediately what kind of study it is?
Yes, they do. They will say this is a double blind randomized control trial. So then you know, okay, this is a pretty legit study. But then you have to read further and say, okay, well, did they well, we'll get to some of these common problems here so that you can
Okay.
apply that to your reading. But let's give another example. Okay, let's say the headlines are and this is going to be close. I don't know if this is exact numbers, but this is going to be close. So let's say statin use. All right. You
Mm-hmm.
know, there are all kinds of side effects associated with statins. All right. You've got really significant muscle pain. You've got the possibility of rhabdomyolysis. You've got cognition issues. It really messes with your brain health over time. They also can cause diabetes in a very significant percentage of the people who take them. So, statin use, not without risk. They are not completely safe drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's say that this headline statins reduce your risk of what? Of high cholesterol, of having elevated cholesterol by 30%. Okay. So that's significant. 30%. Like, okay, that's
Yeah.
big. And let's say it reduces your risk of a cardiovascular event by 30%. All right. So your risk, if you look at the data, if you really look at the data, it said that your risk went from 2% possibility down to 1.4% if you take this statin. Now, okay, so are you going to take a drug that has all these side effects to reduce your risk of a cardiovascular event from 2% down to 1.4%? Because that's what they're saying. That is a reduction, a relative risk reduction of 30%. But
Mm-hmm.
the absolute risk reduction from 2% down to 1.4% is only a 0.6% decrease. That's it. You want to know what does even better than this? Exercise. And there
Mm-hmm.
are no side effects there.
Other
S-
than healthier.
Other than being healthier, right? There's just positive impacts all the way around. So that's why you've got to look at this stuff. You can't just say, well, I'm reducing my risk by 30%. No, you're not. That's a relative risk reduction. They are massaging the data in order to present it in a way that is looks extremely significant. Okay.
Yeah.
But it really isn't.
So those are really good terms to know.
Mhm.
Like, say you go to your doctor and your cholesterol is high, and they're wanting to
Mhm.
put you on the statin,
Yeah.
and they can say, "Well, this can reduce your chance of a heart attack by 30%,"
Yeah,
and
and
then
then
you can
your
be
next
like,
question is that a
"Was
relative risk reduction or is that my absolute risk reduction? Because if that's absolute, I'd sure like to see that study
uh huh,
and then watch what they say.
mm-hmm."
Duh, yeah, sorry.
Andrea
Um,
has a little bit of a toot today.
I'm sorry, I haven't slept. So, yeah, I haven't gotten much sleep the last couple of nights. So the
We like this,
next
Andrea,
number
though.
I want you to know is called number needed to treat.
Okay,
All right.
yeah.
Because this is really significant, especially, my gosh, especially when we're talking about medications and drug interventions. Because what this number there's a corollary. There's a number needed to treat. There's also a number needed to harm. These numbers are essentially the same. But essentially, what that means is how many people need to get this treatment in order for one person to benefit. Okay, now that's a number needed to treat. Number needed to harm means how many people need to either do this or avoid this in order to harm one person. So, like, if you drink to excess, how many people need to drink to excess in order to have one alcohol related death?
Mm.
So you can see they're kind of flip sides of the coin. I'm going to
Mhm.
focus on number needed to treat because that's typically what we see in like drug studies. Okay,
Okay.
so need how many people need to be treated in order for one person to benefit? And I'll tell you, with statins, if you take just general population, and like, as soon as your cholesterol hits a certain number, whether you have other risk factors or not, they want to slam you on a statin. Okay.
Mhm.
So you need to know, from my particular risk assessment, like, what other risk factors do I have if I am low risk in all other categories? Like, for instance, remember our Josh Wagman episodes. Okay, did you have a CAC? Was your CAC zero? What are you a smoker? Do you exercise? All of those things factor into this. All right. So let's say that you do all that stuff. You don't smoke, you exercise, you got a zero CAC, but you got this high cholesterol. Do you know that the number needed to put somebody on a statin, the number needed to treat in order to prevent a cardiovascular event is in the hundreds? So, how many of those hundreds of people that are on a statin deriving zero benefit are having side effects? And it is a
But
large percentage.
mhm.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
number needed to treat, that's another number that is absolutely critical for you to know. Because how many people, so let's say that the number needed to treat for an intervention is 167. Well, line yourself up with 167 people, and all of you are going to be told, you got to take this drug. It's going to cause some cognitive decline. It's going to cause diabetes in a fair percentage of you. And it's going to cause muscle pain and soreness and potentially rhabdomyolysis, which is complete muscle breakdown. It can be deadly. Um, and it's going to cause this in a fair number of you, not the rhabdo, but the muscle pain for sure. Um, and this is so that, again, you're in a line with 167 people, one of you can prevent a cardiovascular event. No thanks. I'm not going to be in that lineup. Now, if the number needed to treat was 3, then yeah, I'll take it, because those odds are, wow, I got a 1 in 3 chance of having a cardiovascular event with my particular circumstances. Then yeah, I will take the intervention. And I'll take my
Mhm.
chances with the side effects. But
Mhm.
but seriously, so that's why this is so critical. And I know this seems like a little in the weeds, but it really isn't. These are critical concepts to know.
Well,
Um,
especially when the side effects, the negative side effects
mhm.
of some of these drugs
Yeah.
are literally deadly.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why in functional medicine, like, so many of our interventions, there's no downside. Like, when I tell you
Exactly.
to cut your stress, when I tell you to get out of these toxic relationships, when I tell you to go move your body, there is no downside. And so
Right.
then, even if we get an incremental improvement, it's still
Right.
all upside. It's
Exactly.
all upside. And very
Mhm.
rarely are our improvements incremental.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if you see a headline that says, "This drug cuts your cancer risk in half," it may only cut your risk from a 0.02% down to a 0.01%. Okay. So, that's my final word on this. You
Yeah.
got to know relative risk ratio versus absolute risk ratio, and you got to know that number needed to treat.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's so good. So good.
So now we're going to talk about common problems in study design. And this is kind of what you were hitting on earlier. So Ashley brought up, yeah, like, what what is this population? Who are they looking at? Because you know what, if they do a study, if they do a drug study for a new drug, guess who they use? Now, it may have changed in the last years, but I doubt it. Um, they used to use college age males for all of the initial phases of human drug studies. You want to know why? Because
They're
they
cheap.
Well, they're cheap. Yeah, that's true. That's true. You give them a few bucks, and like you can take muscle biopsies, you can take blood, you can take whatever you want. And so, but 18-year-old to 20 to about 24-year-old young men, they are like the billy goats of society, right? They can run on any substrate possible. They can run on pizza and beer for, years and still look like a healthy population. The metabolically, their systems are all working. Now, not so much with our population now, sadly, but
Yeah.
historically, this has been the most resilient population, right? They don't have the complexities of female hormonal issues. And so, yeah, it's just like if you're a drug company, it's the perfect study population.
Mm-hmm.
So was this population like when you see a study that looks like, whoa, okay, this was a randomized control trial, or this was a meta-analysis, you got to look at those studies. You got to see who were they testing this on. Was it
Mm-hmm.
18-year-old males? Does this study okay, I want you to ask yourself, if they were looking for study participants, would I have qualified?
Hmm.
And if you would not have qualified for that study, then you need to take a hard look at, okay, this may not apply to me. Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
that is where we get study population. And uh, there, yeah, you want to look for not necessarily just diversity in the study population, but like for instance, if you're a white male and this study group population was African American females, that's probably not going to apply to you. There are also things that, let's say, Eastern Europeans, um, they have genetic predispositions to certain things that they'll study in clinical trials. Well, if you don't come from Eastern European descent, your chance of having that genetic anomaly or whatever it is, that SNP or mutation, is very, very low. So this doesn't apply to you. If they get a population that doesn't smoke and you do, if they get a population that doesn't exercise, that is completely naive to exercise, and then they they put this intervention to this group of non-exercised people, you better believe the results are going to be huge. But guess
Mm-hmm.
what? You're not getting those results because you are not new to exercise. Okay?
Right.
So all of these things matter. You need to know the metrics of the population being studied. Okay? Um Now let's talk about sample size. This is an issue. So again with the energy drinks, there's been so many headlines about energy drinks lately, and I'm just like, okay, these might not be the greatest thing for you to have every day of your life. However, they're not X, Y, and Z as put out by these headlines, right? The headlines are just ridiculous. And a lot of times they're drawing back to one, maybe animal studies. Okay.
Mm.
Or two, they are drawing back to like a study of 10 people. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm throwing that out.
Mm-hmm.
Because 10 people, you could get like one metabolic outlier in a group of 10 people, and it could show this just, it could throw your data completely off. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
that metabolic outlier is like a 1 in 1,000 person. So if you dilute out their impact in 1,000 people, then all of a sudden you've got some significance. But if they're in
Mm-hmm.
a group of 10, they take over the data, right? Like they look more
Mm-hmm.
significant than they really are in the population. So here's what I'll say. You need to understand about small studies. In order to show, there's this concept of statistical significance. Okay? So you'll hear this when researchers talk about the results and conclusions of studies. They'll say, "Well, we found that this did decrease it, but not it wasn't statistically significant." Okay, so you can show a result, but whether it's a fluke or whether it's legit, it all that is what statistical significance means. Like the chance that this could be a fluke in the data goes up when you have small studies. Okay.
Hmm.
So when
Yep.
you have small studies, your result has to be enormous to to be statistically significant. When you have giant studies, you only have to prove a very small improvement or change to prove statistical significance. So, if you got a small study, you better have a giant result. If you've got a crazy big study, then you don't have to prove a big result. You only have to prove a tiny result to say that, yeah, this really works. Okay. All right. So, let's now uh let's now look. Oh, I want to bring something else up just kind of on the fly. Another thing that they'll do with these animal studies, and I'm not throwing all animal studies out because honestly, like I have done a fair amount of digging into animal research because there are animals that we use as human analogs, right? Like they can be manipulated in a research lab to like, look like a human gut microbiome or look like this kind of human metabolic subject, okay? So animal research does have its place. And I'm not throwing all that data out. It should lead to more human questions, right? But sometimes if they are crowing about some kind of animal study data, you'll look at it and you'll see this a lot with supplements, you guys. They'll show animal data, but when you look at how much of that supplement they gave, it's so much. You'd need a truckload of it based on your body weight. You would need a truckload in order to even get close to those results. So you have to look at dosing too. And in animal studies, they can get away with crazy doses of things. And so you have to look at that in terms of supplement studies. Now, they will also do the flip side. They'll say, well, this supplement killed all these rats, so you shouldn't take it. Well, you
Hmm.
look and you find that they gave like 1,000 times the normal human dose.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's not legit either. So it's really, really important that you look at the actual data because people will
Yeah.
cherry pick. And in fact, you guys, I have seen headlines where I'm like, "Whoa, that okay, that's really interesting. I'm going to go back to this study and see what it said." And it said the opposite of what the headline was reporting. That happens more times than you can possibly imagine. So you can't trust it. You just cannot trust it. Um so now let's talk about a concept called endpoints. All right? Endpoints. So remember at the beginning of this I said when you devise a study, you have to know what you're looking for.
Mm.
You can't just go back and say, "Oh, well, we found this and this and this and this." No, you have to know what you're looking for because designing a study that is going to prove statistical significance, that is a whole lot of math, you guys. It's a whole lot of math that I used to know how to do when I was back in grad school, and I don't know how to do now, and I am not interested in doing it now. There are people that this is what they geek out on and they love it, but it's a whole lot of math. Like if I went to one of these mathematicians who do this for teams of studiers, right, researchers, and I said, okay, I want to let's see, I've got this supplement and I want to prove that it decreases your risk of breast cancer and I want to prove a statistically significant reduction. They will spit out numbers for me and they'll say, okay, you got to have this number of subjects with this big of a result in order to prove statistical significance. And I say, oh, hey, I can get way more people than that. Then they'll say, oh, okay, well, so at this number of people, you only have to prove this much of a result. All right. So they will tell you how many people you have to have in order to get to that primary endpoint that you're looking for. All right. So that's called the power of a study. And you'll hear this term batted around. They'll talk about, well, that study was powered to determine X, Y, or Z. So at the very beginning, before you've done anything, you have to know how to power your study, because you can't just go out and randomly say, okay, I think I'm going to get 15 people for this. No, there's a lot of math that goes along with designing a study. And so you have to have that in mind. And that's why you got to know what your endpoint is. Otherwise, you don't know how to properly power your study. Okay.
Mm,
Or how many people you need to recruit to be in your study in order to prove statistical significance. Now, here's what some people will do. They will get to the end of their study, and maybe they did or maybe they didn't prove what they were trying to prove. But then they'll look around at other data that they collected. These are called secondary endpoints. All right. And they'll say, "Hey, but we did find this, and we did find this," and you'll see this all the time too. Headlines will grab these things too. And they'll say, "Oh my gosh, this study proves X." But then you find out that the primary endpoint that the study was powered for was to prove Y. So X might be interesting, but there is no actionable data there. Okay, does that make sense? Like, if you go to prove Y just because X happened, doesn't mean that you proved X. This
mm,
study was designed to prove Y, period.
right.
Not
And then
X, not Z.
proving why you found X, but that
Yeah,
doesn't mean
that
it
X is
proves Y.
significant. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now you can ask the question, you can go back and design another study to prove X, but those secondary endpoints, they don't prove anything.
Okay.
Okay. So for instance, if a primary endpoint, like your why was, we're going to cut down on the symptoms of this disease. Well, then at the end of your study, you find, hey, we also saw that fewer people ended up in the hospital or fewer people died from this. You don't get to say your study proved that, because it
Mm,
didn't.
mm-hmm.
You were powered to prove that you saw fewer symptoms. Not that fewer people died, not that fewer people ended up in the hospital, even if that's what happened. And I know that that's hard because we want to say, yeah, but if it happened, that's not how the math works. It's not
Mm,
how the math works. And I promise, it seems logical to be able to extrapolate that, but you can't. It doesn't
mm,
work.
mm,
Okay. So you got to look for primary endpoints, like what they're reporting. Was that the primary goal of the study, or was that a secondary impact? Because if it was secondary, it is not significant. Okay. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's a it's a that's a complex rabbit hole. But if you take away that secondary endpoints, they are interesting but not actionable.
mm-hmm.
Okay. The next thing, this is an easy point to make, and this is the final thing I'll say is, well, no, okay. Let's go here next. So uh there are surrogate endpoints. So I was talking about extrapolation. While we're talking about endpoints, let's talk about surrogate endpoints. So,
Oh,
let's say we prove that this drug low okay, let's take statins again. They're my whipping boy today. So, let's take statins. You prove that they lower cholesterol.
mm-hmm.
Here's what you don't get to say, because we know they lower cholesterol. We know they do. Here's what you don't get to say. You don't get to extrapolate and say, well, they prevent heart attacks, or they lower your risk of cardiovascular disease, or they lower your risk of, heart attacks and strokes. You don't get to say that. All you proved is that this drug lowers cholesterol. Okay. Another thing, drug drugs that lower blood pressure. Yes, you can prove that that drug lowered blood pressure. What you don't get to say is that it prevents stroke unless you do a study with that primary endpoint that it lowered stroke. Does that make sense? Kind of. Okay. Okay.
It
How
did.
about I'll say it this way. Just because you lowered blood pressure doesn't mean that you are preventing stroke.
Oh, right.
Just because you lower cholesterol doesn't mean you're preventing heart attacks.
Okay.
Okay? So, and the headlines will get this wrong all the time.
So why isn't that just a secondary endpoint? And why is that why is that a surrogate?
The two could potentially be conflated. A surrogate endpoint, however, is more ethereal. It's more like they may not even have proved that this drug prevents heart attacks. A secondary endpoint is something that actually, yeah, it showed up in the data. It actually showed up in the data, but you don't get to link the two. Okay. But a surrogate endpoint is where you say, oh, well, if it lowered cholesterol, then necessarily it prevents heart attacks. No, not necessarily.
Okay.
Okay. Just because somebody's walking around with high cholesterol doesn't mean that they're going to have a heart attack. You don't get to say that because that's not in the
Yeah.
literature anywhere. It's not in the data.
But some people will be like, "Hey, we have a headline out of this."
That's right. Yes, exactly. Exactly. And then the final thing I want to talk about common problems in study design is funding. This is huge, you guys.
Oh
This
my
is
gosh.
so huge. And one of the reasons that it's so huge is not even because the drug companies are funding their own studies, which they are and they should because these are horrendously expensive. But that's why you got to watch them close because they will design it for what they want. All right? But the 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 problem here is that when they get results that they were not expecting, that data, that study gets trashed. It's not published. And that's a problem. That's a
Mm-hmm.
problem.
Yep.
So, you got to know who's funding this stuff. You got to, it's really, it would be helpful for public health if we were privy to the studies that were negative, not just positive.
Mm.
Okay. Now, in universities, now this has become pretty corruptible as well. But it used to be where, you could pretty well trust a university research lab because, it was pure science. We learn just as much from the negative studies as we do from the positive studies. But I mean, so many things within, what we're calling science these days is not science. It's just bought and paid
Mhm.
for.
Mhm.
So the negative results they're not publishing, and that's a huge problem. So, I don't know what you do about that.
Why aren't they required?
That's a really good question, and there are a lot of people asking, why aren't they required? Why aren't they required to publish this? Um, so, yeah, that's just
Because it
something to
doesn't get
be
them more money.
aware of. That's right. That's right. I mean, if it doesn't show what they want, they scrap it.
Yeah.
Um, now, let's see. Let's see. Okay. So let's kind of let's kind of break this down. Um, when you are looking at a headline or a study, I want you to ask who was studied, right? Who was the population? What was measured? That's the primary endpoint. For how long did they study this? Because here's, oh my gosh, study duration. That's another problem, you guys. Man, if they study for 2 weeks, who cares? There
Yeah,
could be a
exactly.
there could be a side effect 6 weeks from now that is hideous,
Right.
but they only study for 2 weeks and they call it good.
Uh-huh.
So, study duration matters. Okay, so how many people? Who were the people? For how long were the people studied? Okay.
Mhm.
Then you got to look at numbers. Okay, what's my absolute risk ratio? What is my relative? Like, are they talking about the relative risk ratio here? Or are they talking about absolute? And also, you need to know that number needed to treat.
Mhm.
Beware of small studies, studies of a short duration, animal studies, and also studies that are non-peer reviewed. However, I will say this. You'll hear about peer-reviewed literature. This is where they submit studies to like a board of disinterested people, right? These are people that don't have any shouldn't have any dog in the fight. However, this has also become highly corrupted. So even peer-reviewed literature is highly corruptible these days.
Question: what would be considered a small study?
Well, again, it all depends. You could have a study of just 10 people that showed a ginormous effect, big enough to be statistically significant. So, is that a small study? Is that too small? No,
Mm.
it isn't because it showed significance.
I guess it's the percentage of results based on the amount of people.
Right. That's exactly right. So, remember, small study, small number of participants, you got to have a massive impact to prove anything.
Oh,
But
okay.
if you got a bunch of people and you show a good result, whoo, that's something worth paying attention to.
Mhm. Okay.
Okay. Also, asking yourself, are they reporting on primary endpoints or secondary endpoints? Right?
Right.
Was this what the original study was set out to prove? Because if they're
Mhm.
reporting something other than that, then it's not actionable.
So, for example, like I just pulled up some random
Hmm.
study, and so the headline of that study is what the catchphrase is. Is that correct? And
Yeah.
then,
Yeah.
like in the description, it'll say objective. The aim of the study was to,
Yes. Uh-huh. Yep, they will. But
but
you gotta go
the
back to the study to find that.
yeah,
Mhm.
okay,
Yeah, because the headline's not gonna tell you, "Hey, they were looking for this, but they accidentally found this."
right,
Yeah.
okay.
Um, so when in talking about significance, um, I was kinda debating on whether I wanted to throw this in or not. Let's just go ahead and toss it out there. There's a value that you'll find within the math of a study called a p-value,
I've heard
okay?
of that.
Yeah. So just kind of tuck this away somewhere. If the and you can always Google it and find it later. If a p-value is less than 0.05, it's significant. That data is significant. So when Ashley was asking about, well, what study would be too small? What study would be
Hmm.
big enough? Well, it really doesn't matter. What matters is this calculated value at the end of the day. And if the p-value is 0.05 or less, then that is significant, no matter what the numbers are. Okay? So that's a way to tell. That's a way to tell. Um,
Okay.
but honestly, you guys, like you don't need to get you don't need to, you know, take semesters of statistics or, you know, how
It's a lot of common judgment
yeah,
once
it
you
is.
understand what you're looking for.
Mhm. It is.
And it takes practice, I'm assuming, because I
Yes,
mean,
it does.
I don't necessarily have practice in reading these,
Yeah.
but
No, and I wouldn't either if I hadn't read thousands of papers. But just knowing a few questions to ask can
hmm,
really up your game.
yeah. And like, so they usually give you like the Cliff Notes versions,
Oh, the
right?
abstract. Yes.
Yes. What about
Yes.
that?
Well, sometimes the abstract doesn't actually correlate with the data that's found within the paper. So here's what I like to I read the abstract, but I also read the study methods because I want to know how this study was put together. I want to know who their population was. I want to know what criteria did they use to recruit study participants. Like if
Mm.
they said we cut out everybody who was doing this or who wasn't doing this. Well, that may have some impact. So it's hard to know without actually going in and reading it. And maybe you and I should go through a study. That might actually be kind of a fun exercise. If we could, like, maybe if people emailed us that they want to do this, what we could
Yeah.
do is we could do a small journal club
Yeah.
and send out a study and then go through it together. And I could highlight okay, this is important right here. This is important right
Mm.
here. And then you could apply that to, your future reading of things.
Exactly.
So, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's something we could do. Yeah, so for any of you who would be interested in that, shoot us an email or send us a message on the socials or something, and we'll put that
We'll
together.
create like a little group,
Yeah.
and we'll get that scheduled.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, I think
we
that'd be
can.
really, really helpful.
Okay. Yeah, we can totally do that. So yeah, that's all I got today. That's
That was
that's
that
that's
that's
it.
all she has,
And on
but
no
that was
sleep.
super,
So sorry for the
super
snark.
informative. No,
Yeah. Whew. Mm,
Mm.
yeah. I was super salty before she hit record, and then we had to read our Bible verses and I had to repent a little bit. So, um,
Yeah,
but all
well,
good. All good.
I was pretty snarky yesterday, and I actually told somebody, I was like, I better check myself
I
before
know.
I open my mouth.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
sleep is
Indeed.
important, people,
It is. It
with
is
so
so
many
important.
factors, but
Oh,
basically, so nobody else dies.
that's right. That's right. The life you save may be somebody else's. Mhm.
Exactly. Go get that little cat nap if you need it.
Mhm.
But no, I think this was really, really helpful. It
Good.
really kind of simplified breaking down a study. So next time you see a catchworthy,
Mm.
eye-catching headline on Instagram, and I'm at fault at
Mhm.
this too, and I usually send them to Andrea and be like, "Is this true?" And
We
then
do
she's
have
probably
lots of
like,
those conversations.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so then she's like, "Well, here's what
Yeah.
we're looking at." And so, no, this was really, really helpful, and I appreciate you breaking it down so simply. And like Andrea said, like if you're kind of like, I don't remember anything that you just said, go back and reread or listen to this
Mhm.
episode. And I was just thinking too, maybe we can create like a nice little Instagram post about simplifying
Hmm.
some of these
Yeah.
things
Yeah,
that could
that's a
be
good
helpful for
idea.
people. But no, I appreciate your time in breaking this down for us. And like Andrea said, if you are interested in learning more about breaking down a study for, especially as people, and I hope that as listeners are listening to this, and if this isn't your first episode, you've listened to multiple, and you're feeling more empowered with your health, and you're feeling more informed and more confident in maybe even questions that you're even asking your primary health provider.
Mhm.
um, just making sure that obviously we're always being respectful of to those individuals, but
Absolutely.
um,
Yeah,
but
because I can guarantee you they are overworked and underpaid for what they do, and nobody gets into this trying to be on the wrong side of things.
right, yeah, they're not
Yeah.
out to
Right.
go ruin your life with
Yeah.
bad health
They're doing the
decisions.
best
They
they can.
truly, yeah, so always be respectful, but I'm hoping too that you can, if your doctor presents like some medication that you're questioning, maybe go outside of your visit and do some of this research, and now you
Yes.
feel more knowledgeable and more confident in going to these studies and being like, all right, was that relative or absolute, or
Yep,
how
that's right.
many numbers needed to treat,
Mhm.
and stuff like that. So thank you, Andrea, as always. You just have a gift of breaking things down so simply for us lay people to understand, and
Oh,
I
thank
appreciate
you.
that. So,
Yeah.
as always, if you have questions, or if maybe there's a specific study that you have been
Oh,
interested in,
sure.
and maybe you saw it on the gram and you're like, I think this would be awesome to talk about, send
Mhm.
it to our way. Our contact information is always in our show notes. And the biggest compliment that we can ever receive is you sharing an episode that impacted you, or that
Mhm.
you found helpful in your health journey. So if you have one of those episodes, please do refer that to somebody. But also hitting that subscribe button, making sure that you
Mhm.
um, are a part of our list for the algorithm, to know that,
Yeah.
hey, this is a podcast that people are wanting and listening and they find valuable. So
Mhm. And if
as
you could
simple
leave
as
us
just
a
a
review.
subscribe. Yes,
Yeah, a
and
review
a
is
review.
huge. Mhm.
Absolutely. So, I believe you can leave a review on individual episodes as well as
Mm.
the podcast as a
Oh,
whole. So,
cool. Okay.
um, but as always, we appreciate you listening and sharing your time with us, because we know it is valuable. And we will catch you on the next episode.
Bye. The content provided in